We need to set up for live. All right, thank you. So my name is Srijan. I go by he, him pronouns. I want to check if all members from both teams are here. Do we have everyone from side affirmative here?
Yeah, we're here. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we also have everyone from side negative?
Oh, yeah.
All right. So before we proceed, I would like to request all individual speakers to please type out your speaker order. And if you want to specify your gender pronoun preferences in the chat, please. And while that process continues, a few general rules to specify. First, all of you have 8 minutes. So anything that is spoken after 8:15 will be completely disregarded from the part of your speech. So please keep that in mind. Also, I'll give you time indication only at 8. So yeah, that means that you have to move towards concluding your speech. Except you are speaking, I request all of you to please mute your microphones. All right, so affirmative consents to streaming. I think negative also indicated that they consent to streaming. All right, thank you. So after the negative speaker order is in the chat, we can probably move forward to starting the debate. Just to clarify, affirmative's veto was third motion. Is that correct?
No, we both vetoed the first motion.
Oh, you both vetoed the first motion. All right, yeah, I just see it now. Both vetoed the first motion. You are debating on the second motion. Is that correct?
Yeah, the one on sticking it to the man.
All right, thank you. So in that event, I hereby call this house to order, and I invite the first affirmative speaker to present the case. Here.
Great. Hi, can you hear and see me?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. If I cut off at any point in time, please feel free to interrupt me and let me know that you can't hear me. Great. Just a second. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Right off the bat, what does actively teaching this looks like and what will it entail? So in terms of characterization, there are a couple of things that we think this is likely to look like. So we think 3 levels of characterization here. Number 1, we support, like, in order to stick it to the man, you have to acknowledge that the man is in a position of authority and a position of power, and something about that needs to change. As a result of that, what we think this does is teaches that the state is powerful and it matters in your life, and hence it is important that the state structures are proper, which means it's important that you have the right people in positions of power. So we teach the importance of state actors. Secondly, we teach to never take things at face value, which means that just because somebody promises something doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to execute that well, because there are complicated interests when it comes to politics. Hence, we teach individuals, we teach the youth to diversify their sources, to read more and to understand information more and seek out as much political knowledge as they can. Thirdly, we're going to teach them that just because you know about something, like understanding that that information exists and knowing that information isn't enough, you also ought to believe that it can be changed. As a result of that, we support teaching about historical revolutions and protests and how that brought forward change for the masses, etc. And we want to teach them that if you want to rally, it really does have value, and that is something that you can do. Why do we think all of this is important? Because framing first, right? We think all societal narratives in general point towards being subservient to states to begin with. What does that look like? That looks like you being forced to follow laws. Everything that you can and cannot do is literally controlled by the state, so you're forced to be subservient. Second, you're bound to political, economic, and educational institutions. You're always bound to some level of institution in your life that you have to adhere to, like schools, jobs, or police force. Thirdly, you are bound to things like nationalism. So even if you're not bound to a state structure, which you are, you're also taught about the idea of a state and being being bound to that through educational curriculums, through things like nationalism. As a result of that, what we do is we counterbalance an already existing disproportionate narrative, and we create youth who are more politically aware. What this is unlikely to result in is complete radical chaos or anarchy. What we posit are an increment positive changes in the political awareness and political activity of the youth. So let's talk about why the youth are not as politically active as they once used to be. There are a couple of reasons behind this, right? Number one, we think that there's a huge cost of protesting. Why? Because you need to take a day off work or school to actually go to protest, etc. But we also think that in general, capitalism teaches you that every second of your day ought to be spent behind doing something productive. So things like hustle culture, etc., means that every second you are not working, you're wasting your time. As a result of this, youth are discouraged to incur the cost that it takes for you to be politically aware, go to protest, etc. As a result of that, there's increasing apathy in the youth. But also, a lot of youth are discouraged from taking up politics as a career, because not only do they not see a future or think that it is closed off, there are also newer and different job opportunities for them as industries keep growing and diversifying. So there are different things for them to do, so they don't see it as a prospective career. So they're unlikely to really care about it, because again, capitalism tells you everything that you do, you ought to do for yourself. If you don't see a future that directly affects you, you cannot pursue that as a career. Unlikely that you're going to care about it. But also there's disillusionment. Why is that so? Because the youth are taught that their voices don't matter. This is a cyclical problem, right? Because it starts when they're often left out of political conversations at home, but they also think that institutions in general won't change anything and their voices are not being heard. As a result of this, there's a lot of disillusionment with the political system that exists. So they're left, so they think that it doesn't matter if they would even go out to protest because nobody is hearing them. This is why they assume that nothing can be done and nothing will change, and there's a sense of hopelessness. All of this means that political parties in general weaponize this. How does that happen? Because then what you're left with are youth individuals who are apathetic and disillusioned, but what you have are rich, privileged, old individuals who lead corporations and are in positions of power, who do things like finance political parties, who do things like enter into politics, who do things like get policies passed. And as a result of that, the policies that end up getting passed are ultimately bad. What does that look like? That looks like Brexit, or policies that affect youth like climate change don't ever get passed because of political deadlocks, because most of the individuals who have that power are actually older individuals. What do we change? What we think is going to happen after this is you are going to have more politically active youth. And as a result of that, political parties themselves are going to consider the youth to be an active voting bloc, and hence are going to try to cater their policies more towards being progressive and something that like they're going to care about the youth because they know that they're going to come up and vote, etc. As a result of that, they're going to cater their policies in a way that's going to appeal to the youth. So why do we think that policies are likelier to be more progressive as a result of this? A couple of reasons. Number one, we think that youth in general are more progressive because society has evolved over time. So things like your quality of education and your access to information, etc., or even things like discussions of morality and moral values and the influence of arts on things like social movements and progression. All of this means that there has been a vast change in the way in which we process the evolution of society and like discussions with regards to progressivism. That's why the youth are comparatively a lot more progressive than the generations that came before them, simply because these discussions and that bulk access to information was unavailable to the generations that preceded them. Secondly, we think that most nations are less insular now because there are things like cross-functional communities, etc., that are a lot more prevalent. So you have a lot more interactions with individuals like minorities because of things like increase in immigration, etc., which means that the youth grew up in a community that is a lot more diverse than nations preceding it, because nations are not that closed off as they used to be. But also, we think that the youth in general are they consider utility to be a very important metric while making decisions. This means that they care more about holistic benefits to their nation and their country because they're going to be alive for a long time and they are going to live in that country for a long time. So they ought to care about they really care about the long-term benefits and changes that can happen and that can make their life better towards the country. That's why they care about more benefits versus the generations that preceding them. They think that the state owes them a debt specifically because they have served the state for a longer time. And as a result of this, they're unlikely to view it as more communal, but rather more selfish. So they want things like pensions and they want things like retirement, etc. So what they do is they think about what benefits them, not necessarily what is the more holistic benefits for communities surrounding them. Lastly, we think because the preceding generations have lived through wars and revolutions and other like changes of the state, and oftentimes they've seen how their state has formed the way that it has, there is a basic image of the state that they want to uphold, and that is why they are more tied to things like that institution and things like their constitution, etc. As a result of that, they don't necessarily want that basic image of their country to change that stops them from being progressive because they're static, their views don't change overall. What is the impact of all of this? We think if we can teach through education to be critical, etc., we think that we can teach the youth not only is it important for them to be politically aware, but also the fact that doing something and rallying, etc., actually counts for something. As a result of that, what we manage is less apathetic, all right, so we think that youth in general are going to become less politically apathetic because they understand that there's something to gain out of this, and necessarily it is untrue that nobody's going to listen to their voices because we're going to tell them that you're protesting, etc. matters. But we also think then, because these individuals are going to become incrementally positively politically active, the political parties in power also have an incentive to cater to them, and hence they have an incentive to make more progressive policies. We've already told you why the youth are generally more progressive. Incredibly proud to affirm.
All right, I would like to thank that speaker for their remarks. In order to continue the case for side negative, I'd like to invite the first negative speaker. Here.
Hello, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's start by responding to the sole argument that we get from side affirmative about making children less politically apathetic and less subservient and deferent to the state and government. Firstly, this seems awfully like an argument to give kids lessons about civics, about political systems, about history, about all the different things that will now allow them to navigate the political system, understand why it's important. And at no point across 8 minutes of speaking time was there ever a reason why sticking it to the man was the best, the only, the unique way to teach these lessons to children. Secondly, I think side affirmative terminally misdiagnoses why the youth are apolitical when they are. It's not that they're taught while they're young to ignore politics. It's that the youth today often face material conditions, like, for example, long working hours for lower wages, like incredibly high house prices in many countries and jurisdictions. That turns them off politics because they have to focus on other material needs in their life. And it's unclear why teaching them to stick it to the man is ever going to change that. Thirdly, it's kind of unclear what side affirmative envisions teaching people to stick it to the man actually accomplishes in politics. Because we're talking about high schoolers, they don't vote, political parties aren't going to go out and start marching around the streets campaigning for high schoolers to go and vote for them. It's really unclear specifically how this actually affects politics. I think we need far more clarity from that from side affirmative. Fourthly though, and I think this hits the crux of side affirmative's argument, maybe in their best case scenario, people go out and protest and they stick it to the man. But why would they do it specifically for progressive causes? Because yes, maybe there's a trend towards progressivism in some countries and jurisdictions. But when I read this topic and I hear stick it to the man, the image that comes to my mind is not a bunch of high schoolers parading around trying to get, the election of the reincarnated corpse of Karl Marx. It's a bunch of anti-vaxxers that are well, we have a fear of authority and the government's out to get us. And that's why we ought not wear masks and sanitize our hands and get a vaccine. And I think that is the core of the problem of side affirmative's case. They teach this idea of sticking to the man, which makes people blindly mad at authority, but does not tell them how to solve the problems that they face in their life, does not teach them how to determine where political systems are failing and what the issues are in society. And because this is the single argument that side affirmative brings, already we are ahead in this debate. Let's move on to substantive analysis. The first argument I'm going to make is why this is a curricular change will be perceived incredibly poorly, and this will make school systems a lot worse. I just think when I hear about sticking it to the man, this is obviously a curricular change that side affirmative has to defend in education systems broadly, which means there's likely a curricular change that is acknowledged, understood by parents, and is likely to be one that is picked up by many conservative political parties. And, I can envision the different types of political campaigns that are likely to be run, of conservative traditionalists saying that these are radical educational institutions that are being co-opted by the left, because because this is already what conservatives do in many countries. And I think this means they're likely to run the types of scare campaigns that make parents think, hey, schools are now teaching your children to become incredibly radical, to not follow authority and not follow your instructions. And that is the sort of thing that turns people off schools. It means in some instances, parents care less about sending their kids to school and policing when their kids go to school. It means they're less likely to care so much about funding education in many instances. And I think this is really, really important in this debate, because I think it is very likely that obviously education is just really important, and getting a worse education system seems like a benefit or seems like a harm that side affirmative has to cop. But secondly, education is prior to many of the political impacts that they want to claim. You need to teach people well and have them go to school for them to understand the political system and actually go to vote and get the sorts of political impacts that side affirmative wanted to hang their hat on. Second argument, this is likely to be taught incredibly poorly, and there are a series of reasons for this. Firstly, like, this is being taught by like crusty old school teachers. Like they don't believe in sticking it to the man, like this like niche punk subculture idea. And I think that is true generally. Like, teachers are authority figures. They are people that kids are going to be skeptical of this message of sticking it to the man coming from. They probably do not believe it, because often people that go and teach and educate in a very hierarchical structured school system probably have not inculcated themselves in punk values. And additionally to the teachers being a poor vessel to communicate this, it's an incredibly complex message. Like, it's not just you got to stick it to the man, it's you got to stick it to the man, and here are all these other implications that are really convenient to the side affirmative case. Like, that is not how kids are going to be interpreting this message. Kids interpret things in a very black and white way. They are kids. And so I think that means they're likely to interpret this message poorly. So this has a number of impacts. Firstly, it means that side affirmative does not get their benefits in this debate because it is taught poorly and unsuccessfully. But secondly, this makes all the earlier arguments about why parents and people in the community are likely to dislike this all the more stronger. Because now you've got kids going home, parents will say stuff like, oh, you got to clean the dishwasher. Kids like, no, I'm sticking it to the man, because that is all they interpret, if anything at all. Third argument, this turns people towards socially undesirable behaviors. This is where I'm going to explain how even in the best case scenario for side affirmative, where this is taught successfully, where it has all of these political impacts and makes people go protest, there are a set of other harms that mean we cannot support this curricular change. Firstly, I think this means that it's far harder to be a successful adult. You are going to have authority figures in your life. You're going to have bosses. You go to university, there's going to be other educators. There's going to be people that you look up to that control parts of your life that you are not always going to agree with. And I think teaching people to just be critical of authority blindly at all times, but without teaching them how to A, critically think, without teaching them B, how to, peacefully resolve tensions, I think that is something that just means that you have far tenser relationships with many of these authority figures that you have a necessary relationship with in order to be an adult. Secondly, and importantly, this renders you as a message very likely to opt into very radical messaging. And my mind is turned back to the example of Egg Boy, who is an example of a guy that egged, an Australian politician. And there are many different examples of people that, throw milkshakes at politicians and things like that around the world. But people that have like this internalized ideas of sticking it to the man and then go around blindly acting, violently towards political figures, which is like what I really envision, like going out and protesting probably is under side affirmative's world. Many of these people just end up turning to literal like fascist movements and outright movements. Because this is a very conspiratorial rhetoric, right? It's like, you should be skeptical of authority figures, like the shady people in the shadows that control, your life, and you have to be skeptical towards them. But B, you're teaching people to stick it to the man, not teaching them what particular values they ought to support and opt into. And additionally, I think this comes at the cost of alternative messages you can send, like critical thinking, like civics, like history, teaching politics in a very objective and apolitical way, which teachers are probably very well placed to do, because that is literally their job. And, it's kind of unclear why students would be, unreceptive to this type of messaging, because they're not going to be skeptical the teacher actually even believes it. And I think this is why you get many people turning towards, for example, fascist movements, or maybe contextually turning to things like anti-vax movements. Because the reason why people become an anti-vaxxer, and the reason why people, don't wear a mask and don't sanitize their hands and don't get the vaccine, is because they have internalized this exact sort of message. Should always just be, oppositional to the state, should not trust authority figures, health experts. That is really, really important. Side affirmative ignores it when they give their single argument. I think we're very far ahead in this debate.
I would like to thank that speaker for this speech. In order to continue the case for side affirmative, I'd like to invite the second affirmative speaker. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you are audible.
Fantastic. First thing I'd like to frame is the exact uniqueness of sticking it to the man. And sadly, it was something that was framed from the start of my first half speech that First Neck just ignored. There's a difference between teaching them about the state, and just that, versus teaching them three separate layers in which they need to interact with the state. First, because its importance, it can affect every single aspect of your life. Second, the fact that there is information that they need to analyze and discern. So to not look at information as just one source being enough, but to seek out multiple sources and discern them for yourself. And three, to act in a particular way, not just take that information and lose out and believe that nothing can be changed, but give them inspiration of the fact that protest can lead to meaningful change. The uniqueness about this is the fact that it will all be centered around state structures and governments, not all kinds of authority, which would really be weird. And it's, I think, a bit of a jump from if you teach them about the state, they will automatically attribute, like bosses and other people as the state. Like, I don't think my boss is the government, guys. I don't know why these kids will start thinking that as well. No explanation of why one leads to the other from First Neck. So the part of the material that they believe that they're running 3 or 4 arguments, like, guys, the third and fourth argument just doesn't make sense. The second thing they say is, this is bad because it will only empower a group that doesn't really vote. The first thing I'd like to say in response to this is, of course, what you teach them right now impacts the way in which they interact with the rest of their lives after getting out of the education system. That's why we teach anything at all, because we want to empower them for the rest of their lives, guys. Otherwise, there's no value in teaching them anything because they don't use it then and there. The second is, even if it's about usage then and there, surely there are ways in which they can practice the political process while still in high school. So doing things like reading articles, making a habit of understanding what's happening around them and understanding the state, understanding the complexities of government structures, which, by the way, even most of us debaters don't understand the US government and how it operates. Those are the small things that they can do. They can start being inspired to enter political careers, take part in student protests, or enter the student council, all of which end up becoming a way in which their real lives are reflected. The next thing they say is, no, this will just be taught poorly because teachers are really bad vessels through which this is spread. 4 responses to this. Number 1, we can have standardized texts, videos, and books that all teachers have to abide by the same way all national curriculums are. You can't change the interpretation of that video. You can't change the text that's written in the book. So there will be a standardized interpretation of that. Surely this will be made by experts and like really professional people that are neutral. Number 2, the nature of the content is apolitical because we don't teach them to critique one political party. We teach them to critique political structures and how they've been homogenized. So there's no discomfort that a teacher will feel by virtue of her political identity because she can neutrally critique state structures, not necessarily critique a party. Third, teachers aren't big fans of the state, guys. They're really underpaid in most countries, and teachers as a career, especially ones for high school, aren't really the most privileged groups of people. Number 4, we think there will be multiple teachers in any school. So one bad interpretation, the same way like you might have one bad math teacher that doesn't teach you math, can be counterbalanced if it's made a course that multiple teachers have to teach over a period of time. So there will be different interpretations that children can enter. They then say that, this looks like really bad rhetoric spreading all across society, anti-vaxxers and their rhetoric, right? So the first thing I'd like to posit is this is based on the message being taught to them poorly. I've already responded to that. So none of that material makes sense because it's premised on them proving that questioning all authority is the result of this model. The second is, I would posit that there are overarching narratives in society that teach you to be subservient. Like the fact that you need to follow laws, and laws in and of itself are something that can never be broken by virtue of your, liability to society. The fact that you need to respect the nation and the idea of this nation that we've created. So you do things like understand the national anthem, read about the history of your country, all of which makes you believe that you should be subservient to this great nation that we've created. So this rhetoric is not overarching, it's a counterbalancing act to the deep-seated narratives that exist in society for you to be subservient. This doesn't radically shift, but only counterbalances. Number two, there are non-state actors that can make you feel like you have stuck it to the man, so you don't go out and rally for anti-vaccination, because non-state actors that are like, the Fauci's and the important people in the world who are not part of the state, who you do trust, by the way, are likely to say that this is something that we genuinely need. Even if you don't believe non-state actors, there are fundamental biological needs or needs by virtue of your actual experience as an individual that social norms cannot counterbalance. So the fact that you don't make as much money is something that you ought to change, or the fact that you don't have a good education is something that you genuinely feel as an experience. The third is, even if these movements accumulate and these movements tend to be radical, of course, all movements and the leaders within them have to have a selling point of success, i.e. saying that we did stick it to the man, which means that your perpetual questioning cannot exist forever, because then you have never stuck it to the man, guys. So for you to stick it to the man, there has to be a point where you agree that we have finally done it, and leaders within that movement take pride in the fact that they've achieved that success. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, this will not result in overarching random chaos, because that will end up hurting these people and they feel like they haven't stuck it to the man, and the movement internally cancels that out as well. The last thing they say is parents don't send their kids to school. I'll just say that parents don't want their kids to die out of not getting jobs and certification. I think that's more important than this weird distrust, right? Surely the fact that vast majority of Bangladeshi schools teach things like neutrality and non-religious education would have been big enough of an incentive for conservative parents to not send their kids, but we still get sent to school where we learn about atheism, and that's why we end up debating. The final thing that I'd like to weigh is this argument of climate change. And why is it the most important in the debate? The reason this is important is, first of all, they didn't respond to why we make more progressive policies when the youth are more politically empowered. But the reason it is important is it affects an infinite number of people. And these consist of individuals who are not even born right now. Youth are people who are born right now, but climate change not only affects them, but also affects groups that are unborn. The reason this is important is because lottery of birth is arbitrary. The same way you don't choose where you're born, you also don't choose at what point of time you're born into. So surely there's no moral value that the people existing now have more in superseding metrics to the people who are not born right now. This means climate change, if it literally kills humanity, is the most important argument in the debate, because it is a policy that needs to effectively save billions of lives in the future. The only way to pass reformist policies for climate change is when the youth are empowered, because otherwise rich corporations that the old people are privileged to will continuously make money. That's why clearly, I don't think this is a separate argument, it's framing. But if you want this to be a separate argument because you think we don't have separate arguments, please respond to climate change. Otherwise, you're losing.
All right. I would like to thank that speaker for their speech. In order to continue the case for side negative, I'd like to invite, the second negative speaker.
Hi, just checking that I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay, excellent. I'll get started in 3, 2, 1. 2 questions in this speech. Firstly, I will ask whether school is the right place to learn this narrative, even if it is a good narrative. And then secondly, I will ask whether this is a narrative which children are likely to relate to and apply beneficially. So on the first idea about whether or not school is the right place to learn stick it to the man narrative, note that this, if we can prove that it is not, this is fatal to the affirmative team's case, because even if they can prove that this is a good narrative, it is unclear, I think, that schools are the correct actor through which to transmit it. On negative, we bring you 2 claims as to why schools are a poor actor to transmit this narrative. Firstly, we tell you that schools are set up in a way which naturally reduces the credibility of this narrative. So, like, what does that mean? Well, one, we suggest that people involved in the schooling system, whether it be the people who set the curriculum, whether it be teachers, whether it be parents, often by virtue of being adults with established careers who pay their taxes and own a car, etc., have buy-in into the state and have, at least to some extent, a belief that some level of authority is beneficial. But secondly, schools are set up around power structures and around systems of authority. Children in school have very little power. Children in school are encouraged not to question that which their teachers tell them. And generally schools kind of function by virtue of that authority existing. We suspect that teachers would struggle a lot more if kids simply, were permitted to ignore them when they told them a lesson, etc. Thirdly, we tell you that kids just don't really like being propagandized to. So kids are often kind of black and white thinkers, are often, in their teenage years, relatively rebellious and skeptical. And I think at the point where you have someone who every day tells you to hand in your homework in time and, make sure you listen to everything that they say, and they're now standing up and they're being like, well, you have an obligation to, like anyone who's in power, anyone who's in authority, you need to you be really critical towards them. You need to think that through. That's something which doesn't necessarily gel well to a kid. They're likely to view that quite skeptically. The second thing we tell you is that schools are particularly vulnerable politically. They are often a site of culture wars. They often face attacks from the right wing. And we tell you that this is something which is likely to uniquely attract a huge amount of outrage. Like literally setting up textbooks and whole lessons around rebelling against the government, around, focusing intense critique on the government is likely to be something which leads to reduced funding for the schools that do this. It's likely to lead to threats towards teachers. It's likely to lead to parents disengaging from their children's education. What response do we hear from the affirmative to this material? The first thing that they do is they kind of perhaps not recharacterize, but provide some additional characterization of what they expect these lessons would likely look like. They tell us that it is, one, exclusively about the state, and two, that it predominantly involves doing things like media analyses and unpacking media items and things like that. A few responses to this material. Firstly, please refer to the info slide, which refers to political authority broadly. It's not clear to me that, affirmative can just fiat in that this debate is exclusively about the state. I guess the structural reason here is stick it to the man is about power structures. When you're justifying why you ought to stick it to the man, we're talking about power structures and hierarchies, not exclusively the state. So you likely do need to tell students to distrust authority broadly. And even if you don't do so explicitly, it's likely they interpret that message from it. Secondly, we tell you that doing things like media analysis and reading the news is an incredibly uncontroversial part of students' education. For example, I do it with the kids who I tutor debating. I'm not propagandizing to them. I'm not telling them to overthrow the government. We do it, for example, in language classes when you are dissecting a news piece or a piece of literature. It is clearly inexclusive to the stick it to the man narrative. I think they're going to have to take on a little bit of a better or higher burden, I think, in this debate, in order to create any benefit whatsoever. But thirdly, note that they kind of undermine their own claim that they're going to teach children to scrutinize the government in a directed way when they're like, well, we're not going to teach anyone to support a political party. It's still going to be very apolitical. So I think it's very unclear how this is then distinct from doing things like teaching children about democracy or about corruption in broad terms, something which you already see in civics classes, which is not particularly closely related to the stick it to the man narrative. The next thing they tell us is, in response to our claim that this is taught quite poorly, is that we can have experts and textbooks. I would just like to know, who is this expert? What is the stick it to the man textbook? I think it is at no point successfully characterized by side affirmative how this differs from a civics textbook or an ethics textbook or a history textbook. All of their examples seem to fit quite neatly within those things. And we think that's pretty telling because those things do allow children to reflect on their society. They do set them up with the tools to understand their political system. I still do not understand at this point in this debate why this is distinct. The final thing that they say is that, maybe you don't get the harms of schools being assailed politically because lots of kids still go to school, even though schools are controversial. This is probably the least charitable possible response. Even if kids still attend school, it is far less likely that parents provide active support. It is likely that the messages they hear in school are contradicted from all sides in the media by their own parents. That is something which still undermines the education system, even if kids attend school. We gave you that material at first to literally no response. All right, I think at this point I've proven that schools are particularly poor places, to teach this narrative. But let's then turn attention to whether or not this narrative is a good thing to teach people. Because note, affirmative's case I think is broadly contingent on the idea that people are going to be rebelling against the state effectively. And so if we can prove that this is often pernicious, that this leads to people being, for example, more aggressive, then we are significantly ahead in this debate. The first thing I want to note is that social awareness can clearly exist on both sides of the debate. And I think this is pretty much conceded when Affirmative tells us that children have progressive instincts and that they are often, less insular than their ancestors. They're plugged into the internet. They are increasingly inclined to be progressive for a bunch of material reasons. Given that that exists on either side of the debate, we suspect that kids can often, learn to stick it to the man independently if it is indeed a good narrative. But also, we would tell you that things like history and civics can often lead kids to be interested in politics, and then these progressive intuitions can carry them further if that is what our opponents want. They do not successfully explain why the school specifically needs to direct already progressive kids to be more progressive. That is totally unexplained. The next thing I guess then to ask is, what is distinct about the stick it to the man narrative? We tell you three things. One, it's indiscriminate. It tells you it valorizes anti-authority sentiment without underlying values or critique. Secondly, its framing is that power is bad and those who aren't in power is good, which is just, I think, an untrue narrative to tell people about the world. Secondly, it is conspiratorial. Even the framing of the man, well, that means there is a man making active choices to screw you over. It frames the state as being evil rather than just incompetent or subject to structures which lead it to be ineffectual, etc. Thirdly, it is unconstructive. Look to punk and anarchism, right? These are not necessarily movements which provide articulate solutions to social problems. They are often born out of a general frustration with the world. It's unclear why Affirmative can, allow these kids to articulate solutions to social problems. Okay, what then are the unique impacts of these distinctions with this narrative? One, we tell you that this makes kids uniquely vulnerable to being co-opted by regressive narratives. So maybe it was the case that kids had progressive intuitions, but uniquely when you encourage them to be, knee-jerk suspect towards figures of authority, towards the government, it was far more likely that pernicious actors, opposition parties, for instance, radical groups, could tap into that and tell children, you don't trust the government, you're being screwed over, and recruit them through that. And that is just objectively the way that the vast majority of alt-right groups in the status quo recruit young people, is by tapping into anti-authoritarian intuitions. We prefer not to feed into that. Additionally, and I think the only real response we get here is, one, maybe there are non-state actors who stop.
Hi, I cannot hear you anymore. Is this just the issue with me?
No, we can't hear it either.
All right. Probably the rest of the team members can try and, oh, sorry, they have the same device.
Yep, same device.
I've texted on Discord from Orcom. Srijan can do that too. Thanks.
I just spoke with them over the phone. They'll be joining shortly. The internet died, so I think they're hotspotting or something. So yeah.
All right.
Hello.
Hi,
Hi,
yes.
hi. Hi, sorry, we're having internet issues. Can you hear us?
Yes, you're audible now.
Okay.
Also, we're on the last 15 seconds of your speech. So I have you paused on 7:45. So perhaps, yeah.
Okay. I'll just conclude quickly then, because do you know what was the sort of last sentence that I said?
Discussion around anti-authoritarianism and the lack of response. Yeah.
Okay. Starting again in 3, 2, 1. The only real responses that we hear are, firstly, that there might be non-state actors who reduce students' propensity to do things like rebel, which necessarily rebuts Affirmative's own benefits. And secondly, the idea that this might be counterbalancing pro-state narratives. But I think that it's unexplained why these narratives must come from schools, why kids internalize them in a way which is positively pro-state, and ultimately why these narratives necessarily tap into the progressive sentiment that Affirmative assumes it does. At the end of this, I think we need clear explanations of those questions at third Affirmative, and I think that negative is fine.
All right. I would like to thank that speaker for their speech. In order to complete the substantive portion of case from side Affirmative, I'd like to invite the third Affirmative speaker. Here.
Audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Few things in the speech. First, I'm going to talk about the framing of the motion, sadly, because of the way in which the debate turned out. Secondly, I'm going to talk about political apathy and why it's important to remove political apathy. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about what kind of a change do we get? Do we get constitutional change, or do we get more positive change like climate change? And lastly, I'm going to talk about other incidental stuff like teachers and so on and so forth. Firstly, with regards to the framing of the motion, if you look at the info slide, it says political authority, not all authority, which means that if they want to implicate that, they had to explain why, in order to teach for you to rebel against political authority, you have to teach them to rebel against all authority. Clearly, they are not the same thing, and clearly that does not mean the way in which you teach it. Obviously, political authority does involve things like state, entrenched political structures such as political parties, and so on and so forth. It does not necessarily need to be your boss or your teacher, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't matter if the school is a hierarchical structure. You're not rebelling against all forms of hierarchy. You're rebelling against the most important forms of hierarchy that is existing in your life, which is the state and the state structures, and so on and so forth. They need to explain why one is a prerequisite to the other. They need to explain why there was an overlap. I'm pretty sure in terms of characterization, third negative is actually quite late in this particular instance. So I don't think any of the arguments that stem from that is true. So with regards to school implementation and so on and so forth, we should be fine. But more importantly, if you look at the info slide again, it starts with politically aware and then go about things like rebelling against political authority. The reason this is important is because the info slide sort of indicates as to in which direction do you turn the youth towards. You first make them politically aware and then let them go and rebel against political authority. And the sort of critique they're doing against with regards to punk or any forms of countercultures, literally countercultures that were like prominent in the 80s and 90s, where things like, NWA that came up with songs such as F the Police, because there was police brutality towards, minority groups and so on and so forth. These are the examples at which we talk about. Punk and rebellious cultures have not been bad. They have indeed been, in a lot of circumstances, a positive influence in society. But more importantly, in a lot of cases, the way in which any curriculum is taught in school, it's with regards to researchers and professionals who construct curriculums that read curriculums. For example, education curriculum is a subject in university that is taught, research, and so on and so forth, which can be then trickled down into the sort of things that are taught. But if you still cannot envision how this is going to be taught and why the school system is not going to fall apart, just imagine a university where you have like liberal schools education, where literally every time you're taught to critique things like the state because they do illiberal things all the time. And in those circumstances, university students oftentimes in certain courses are actually taught to, critique and stand against state structure, stand against political authority and so on and so forth. We can just have that version in high school. I don't think everything else will fall apart in this particular instance. The other stuff that is there with regards to this is like, oh, what if parents don't want to engage with the school system in this particular instance? We don't think this is true in because there is a lot of utilitarian benefit with regards to engaging with the school. Things like you get a high school degree, you get better jobs and so on and so forth, means that parents are obviously likely to engage with the school, means that like you want your child to learn about mathematics and other stuff. So even if this is something that you disagree with, this is like the same thing that we have with regards to teaching evolution, we can teach this as well, even if it's controversial, that should be fine as well. The reason this then becomes important is because when it comes to political apathy, the reason political apathy is so unique to negative cases, because in case of political apathy, it is important for you to feel powerful. And there's nothing in civics textbooks, politics textbook that you teach in high school that makes you feel powerful. By feel powerful, I mean, makes you feel like if you rebel and if you protest, there can be an outcome. If you question political authority, it is a value in and of itself. These are things that are unique to sticking it to the man and not any other forms of political discourse. You can teach them all about why voting is important. You can teach them all about how civic disobedience happens. But if you don't teach them that an overwhelming authority can be questioned, they won't feel the necessity to engage to the political system at the similar level. And the reason this is true is because frustration with political system is something that is a constant in both the worlds, which means that you are more likely to feel frustrated. The fact that there is no change in the United States for a long, long time. The fact that even though people want gun bans, you cannot have gun bans. The people want universal healthcare, you still cannot have universal healthcare. These frustrations are constant on both sides and are decrippling. The only structural way in which you can make people care about these things is if you make them feel like if they care, they can make a change. The reason then this is not then flipped into something like conspiratorial, where like kids are uniquely vulnerable, they are prone to believing conspiratorial theories, is because when it comes to intuitions existing within society, it's not just regressive intuitions that exist in society with regards to rebelling against the establishment. Bernie Sanders is a good example of rebelling against the establishment. There are lots of left-wing examples of trying to rebel against the establishment and having anti-establishment rhetoric. So this is not a intuition that exists so widely. But more importantly, the things such as conspiracy theories and so on and so forth are not overwhelming narratives that exist in society. So maybe worst case, yes, some people will pick up on it, but in vast majority of circumstances, these are not the intuitions that they will pick up on. There's also structural analysis on our side, as to why the intuitions that they form are likely to be progressive intuitions that go against these things. So for example, if you are progressive, then you're likely to generally believe in things like science and so on and so forth, which is a progressive value that is attached. But number two, it is important to understand here that frustrations through which people become anti-state. So for example, if you see that there's a huge overlap between anti-vaxxers and people who are generally supporters of anti-establishment candidates like Trump and so on and so forth. The frustration that leads to that exists in both worlds. What is unique to our world is that you feel like there is a way out of that frustration. You feel like all your peers think the same way. You feel like the youth can rise up and make a change in society, whether it be critiquing, whether it be protesting or any other form. In a world where you believe that this change is possible, is the only world in which you can have an outlet for frustration. Theirs is the world where people get too frustrated and then lash in different ways. And that leads to things like, Trump being elected and so on and so forth. So that is a burden that they need to do. Here, I would like to weigh this very properly here. Understand that because of progressive intuitions and because of structural reasons, they're more likely to believe in things like climate change that are likely to change society. Even if there are some people who, like maybe there's a marginal increase in people who believe in anti-vaccine, but if anti-vaxxers and so on and so forth. However, if there are more people who believe that climate change is a policy that is worth fighting for and is worth speaking out against in your 20s, and there's a youth movement that is galvanized in favor of it, then politicians are forced to make that change because youth are a big voter bank, right? People who are from your 20s to 25s to 30s are a big voter bank, especially, you teach them now, they will become voters 10 years, 5 years later. They are able to make meaningful change within society. And that meaningful change is way more important than some people picking up on conspiratorial theories. That is just like if you think about it generally, there's just so low probability that does not make any difference within this debate. Lastly, with regards to other incidental mechanistic quabbles with regards to teachers, I think Sajid already responded to it with regards to teachers as to why, because teachers themselves generally are anti-state, we can make curriculums designed in a particular way. But I think it's more important to note here in this particular instance that the way in which you shape a curriculum, that authorities that shape a curriculum do have unique sort of abilities to transfer the message to students in a lot of ways. So for example, the first time when we introduced evolution, a lot of people did not want to teach evolution because it went against their beliefs. But still it was like possible to convey that to them because the power of curriculum is so overwhelming when you are included in things like textbooks, and like at the current moment you have things like other things like videos and so on and so forth. But more importantly, if you think that in a lot of cases, sticking it to the man itself is something that is conspiratorial, I tell you that these authorities are likely to not make it sound like conspiratorial because there's like no value in doing that. The value that exists in teaching this narrative is the value through which you can convince the people that there is a value to making a change. There is a value to rising up against the state and so on and so forth. At the end, it's important to note that the establishment, the state, is so screwed up right now that even in the most advanced of democracies, minorities get shot by the police without no reason whatsoever. Negative needs to give you a good enough reason as to why the establishment is actually doing well, and they have not done it throughout the bench. Incredibly proud to affirm.
I would like to thank that speaker for this speech. In order to complete the substantive portion of case from side negative, I would like to invite the third negative speaker. Here.
Can I just check that I'm audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. All right, starting this speech in 3, 2, 1. It is with great sadness and with heavy heart that I must start this speech by defining what it means to stick it to the man. And it's worth sort of looking to some examples of where this statement has been said. It has been said by punks who were active in the 80s and absolutely did not achieve any sort of meaningful political change. The ones that didn't die from drug overdoses, alcohol, and too much damn sex are now currently flogging NFTs on Twitter. The other place in which this appears, the way in which, you know, the song for this motion was from School of Rock, and it is in the context of a teacher literally teaching kids to skip class. Like, this is what it is. And I think the reason that Affirmative spends so much time in all of their speeches on setup is because they realize that they can't actually win the debate on the argumentative portion of the debate. Instead, they try to redefine stick it to the man as this like, you know, amalgam of like, be selfless, do good things, mistrust certain authorities, but not other authorities. And you'll know what the right ones are because children are already correct. Look, it's side negative that actually has 2 feet in reality and actually knows what the phrase stick it to the man means. And that's, I think, why we are ahead in this debate. 3 parts to this speech. First of all, it's very strong and very significant independent costs of implementing this in the school curriculum. We would note just how unpopular this is. It is seen as brainwashing children with left-wing propaganda. It is literally everyone's worst nightmare that schools are teaching kids not to listen to their parents. This is very different to evolution, which goes against a single part of the Bible for a very certain minority of people that take the Bible literally. This is very different. And if side Affirmative wants to make an argument by analogy, they better use something that's analogous. This is about something that threatens the very structure of society in the eyes of conservatives, not something that goes against a single religious teaching. There are 2 consequences of this. First of all, people are likely to pull kids from school, and that is because a large percentage of the world's parents are quite reluctant to send kids to school because, for instance, those kids could be working for you. They could be doing other things. Side Affirmative has one limp response, which is, well, parents want their kids to learn math. Yes, there is one reason to send your kids to schools. We are saying that this is a significant reason not to send your kid to school. It is far more likely that on Side Affirmative, more people are, for instance, homeschooling their kids, or for instance, just setting them to work at a young age. This isn't just set in like the liberal West or whatever. The second problem is there is far less fundings for schools because there is a significant part of the political scene, namely all conservatives, or like, I guess literally everyone who has a job in politics and wants to be trusted, like they are going to oppose this and they are going to go against education. Side Affirmative says, well, universities do this and universities are fine. Like, have you read the news? Like literally the University of Sydney is cutting units in response to like, you know, general right-wing government opposition to the left-wing brainwashing enterprise. This is also happening across the world. I know this is happening in England. Most universities are raising fees across the board. And also, secondly, this is disanalogous because this is about brainwashing children and school is mandatory, whereas university isn't. So it is likely that you get fewer people in schools, you get less funding for schools. And this is probably the most important issue in the debate because the people that miss out on education on Side affirmative are the ones who most need to be exposed to new ideas, to get out of the grip of their family, to experience new ideas, the people of the lowest socioeconomic background who need this economic mobility. It is unfair for side affirmative to throw them under the bus to get this long shot at somehow solving climate change. That is why side affirmative or side negative is ahead. The next issue in this debate is this is probably transmitted quite poorly. We say that teachers, as authority figures, are ill-placed to spread this sort of message. They say, well, the info slide says political rather than anything else. But first of all, teachers are invested with their power by the state. Given they are literally part of a state education system, their authority is inseparable from political authority. But second of all, it's not like kids see nuance. If they're saying mistrust the government, that will be read as, you know, don't trust those who are in control, read those who are teaching you right now. So teachers are unlikely to believe this message to begin with, given the state is paying their wages or whatever. And so they are probably going to be unenthusiastically teaching this, or they're going to come across as hypocrites. The next thing is that the curriculum is likely bad, because side affirmative's workaround to teachers being bad is we will just have an anti-authority textbook, which isn't a model so much as a punchline. Like, I don't know what's going to be in this textbook. They haven't given us any details about it. I'm not sure what it's going to be except fucking Limp Bizkit lyrics or whatever. Like, what is going to be in it except, for instance, things like how to think critically, how to, like, the history of protest or whatever, which is literally the status quo. I do not know what they're doing. The last reason this message is going to be transmitted poorly is because students are going to receive it poorly. They tend to interpret things in a very absolutist way, but also they don't like being propagandized to. So the upshot of this issue is A, you probably turn kids off politics, because the coolest way to get people into politics is to say, you know, the state's out to get you or whatever. And in this case, it's your, like, the squarest teachers with the widest hair who are saying, like, oh, mistrust, like rebel against the state, which isn't very persuasive at all. But two, those kids who do buy into this narrative buy into it over much, again, because of their overstimulated, their like over receptivity, because of their absolutist tendencies. And so they're going to be overly mistrustful of authority, which means, for instance, they're probably, I don't know, less likely to do homework, but also going to be far worse politically into the future. So even if it is a good message in theory, in practice, it will not be transmitted well. That is the second level on which side affirmative wins the debate. The last one deals with the best case, wherein teachers are perfectly logical, students are perfectly logical, and there are no negative kickbacks as a result of this policy. Still, the norm of sticking it to the man, or rather the mentality, is atrocious. First of all, it is conspiratorial and misdiagnoses the problems that exist in society, because, you know, when the substitute teacher says the man is chopping down the rainforest, he means there's some evil cabal that wants to cause harm to you, which is incredibly conspiratorial and misguides the thing as just the profit motive, people trying to do their jobs and whatever, which are the things that you actually need to solve in order to get proper political solutions. Second of all, it lacks a positive vision. That is, the idea of sticking it to the man is about being individually pissed and about being individually disengaged. Punk is not about activism or mutual aid or giving to charity or writing policy papers, things that are sort of like, you know, things that characterize support of the Bernie Sanders movement or whatever, things that can actually drive people towards an end. And it is this lack of a positive vision in the sticking it to the man mentality that means that all the punks end up burnt out and selling out at the end of their careers. We think what is likely is kids who buy into this disengage from politics because you hate the man. You don't want to play his game. You don't want to run for parliament because parliament is run by the man and all of those other things. But third of all, it encourages mistrust of all other political authority. And it is strange that Affirmative sort of puts on their affirmative colored glasses and sees that the problem in the world is people trust authority too much. You know, they're trusting the New York Times. They're trusting the news that says you should get vaccinated. And like, they're trusting, you know, the centrist governments, and they're not voting for like, you know, fascists or whatever. We think trust of the government is necessary for a society to function. So what is Affirmative's benefits here? They say, well, we mobilize the youth. A, we do that as well because we can teach things like media criticism, the history of protest, and all of those other things. Teaching people to stick it to the man isn't the only way to get kids involved in politics, because right now people are getting involved in politics, and it is increasingly so through other means such as positive visions for policy. But second of all, what does Affirmative mobilize them for? Because they have this fallacy that the youth is always right because some of them care about climate change. Like, look, Al-Shabaab literally translates to the youth, and I disagree with them on a lot of policy stances, but also it's like the youth are often wrong. Often the most enthusiastic supporters of fascist campaigns are the youth. The most enthusiastic opponents of lockdown mandates are the youth. And that is why this is a bad thing in theory. It is bad in practice. And even if it was good in practice, there are so many harms in addition to this. That is why side negative is so proud to oppose.
All right. I would like to thank that speaker for their speech. In order to summarize the case for side negative, I'd like to invite the negative reply speaker. Here.
Okay. Hello. Just double checking I'm audible. Actually, can you turn off your phone? This is, yeah, just the time. For one moment. Oh, thanks. Okay. I'm assuming that you can hear me. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Side affirmative has been very slippery in this debate. At different times across their case, sticking it to the man means different things based on what they feel is convenient to them in the debate. At different times it is, well, reacting to media articles, is learning about civics, or it's going out and actively protesting against an authoritarian government. Because of this lack of clarity, I will start this reply by asking, assuming schools teach the idea of sticking it to the man to their students, what lessons do the students actually take away? And the reason I'm starting here is that's the fastest way to understand why side negative wins the debate, because here is where we show without a shadow of a doubt that schools are bad places to teach this message of sticking it to the man to the students, so it will either be unsuccessful or incredibly distorted. Side negative here gives you a series of reasons why schools would teach it poorly. That's by and large being taught by authority figures, so naturally students are going to be skeptical of a contradictory message, but that students are likely to have this be a very complex narrative, and because they often think very simplistically or in a black and white way, they're unlikely to get the raw, nuanced, absolute best case scenario case that side affirmative wanted to push. And the strategy of side affirmative was by and large not to respond directly to the individual mechanisms we gave, but instead give their own reasons why schools were a good place to teach them. Firstly, they say, well, we can teach it in textbooks written by experts, which we point out at our second speaker and third speaker, seems to really be an argument for our side. This is the exact sort of dry authoritarian way of teaching this that is likely to make students unresponsive or have a distorted message taken away. Secondly, they say, well, teachers are often underpaid and anti-state. And, even we point out that even if you literally have like a hippie teaching the class, teachers have a variety of different vested interests. They care about keeping their job, having a veneer of professionalism, making sure that their children remain disciplined and listen to their lessons, which means the lessons come across in a way which is very authoritarian and structured. And this activates all the arguments we give, how this is unlikely to be a very constructive norm, how it leads to poor relationships, because even if a side affirmative wants to claim it's just about politics, if you interpret it poorly, you're going to apply it to bosses and educators. That leads to poor relationships, which everybody has in their life. Or lastly and importantly, in an independent way that we can win the debate, it leads to incredibly regressive attitudes. There's the overlap between this and very conspiratorial sentiments. And the strategy of side affirmative is to say, well, these sentiments exist on both sides of the debate, but this clearly cannot win them the clash, because our case was that this happens more because these people that would otherwise be perhaps naturally progressive, as affirmative says, are now going to be co-opted by many authoritarian and anti-vax and conspiratorial movements. Now, secondly, in this reply speech, assume that this is taught exactly in one of the many different ways that side affirmative claims they will be taught. Is this a narrative that we want people to learn? So let's actually just assume the best case scenario. And I think the crux of side affirmative's case is that children are naturally progressive. When they learn to stick it to the man, they're going to challenge the state and do things that are good, like, for example, push back against pleas to have climate action. To this line of analysis, we had a series of responses. Firstly, this was obviously contingent on being taught successfully. So if children don't properly internalize this norm, they never reach the tipping point needed to change state policy, which is presumably what side affirmative wanted to win the debate on. Secondly, though, I think we also give a series of reasons to believe, like, for example, you're unlikely in many instances have parents doing things like, literally like sending your children to school. Because even if it's the best case version of this, like, conservatives are going to co-opt it, parents are going to feel like it's anti-them. So you literally don't get many children even going to school in the first place, which seems prior to, actually being able to go and stick it to the man in politics. You need to learn things in, civics classes and history classes about how to navigate the political system. And additionally, right from the start of our case, we explained how there's a trade-off between sticking it to the man and spending time on other ways you can actually navigate the political system. So at the end of this point and at the end of this speech, look, I think this is a very clear win.
All right, I'd like to thank that speaker for the speech. In order to summarize the case for side affirmative, I'd like to invite the affirmative reply speaker. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Fantastic. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Negative accuse us of a lot of things, but sadly they forget debate rules and they then accuse us. The first reason why they forget debate rules is because they assume that they can make punk narratives sound like whatever they want and they don't have to stick to the info slide. While we've continuously told you that this debate is only about political authority and the Edge Corps believes it's only about political authority, for you to expand it into something else, there needs to be logical analysis of why one is dependent on the other. It cannot be an assumption of what this narrative is and illustrating it in any way you want. There has to be logical step-by-step analysis of one leading to the other. The second reason is, like, just hear what they're saying. It's almost crazy. Like, if a teacher teaches a kid self-defense, automatically this means the kid is just going to start fighting everybody on the street, right? Like, because you learn self-defense. That's the same line of logic for if you teach a child to distrust political authority, they will distrust everything and everyone that has authority, right? And I'm still unclear at the end of this debate what the logical link from one to the other is. Maybe kids are impressionable, maybe they're young, but why does that impression translate into one from the other is not an explanation that I've received from any of the negative speakers, even in third. That's why, if you really look through your notes, unless this stands, none of their harms of their side stand. But even if this stands, we gave you some very concrete responses as to why the evolution of the movement that we create does not devolve into anarchy. The first is because the criticisms that they have will need to be internally magnified and controlled for them to finally believe they stuck it to the man and therefore attribute success to something they deem as success. How they do that is by analyzing the benefits they've sought and the increments that they've gained. This was something that was mentioned explicitly in my speech with no further response. The second thing we told you is a comparison of this social narrative with other social narratives that make you subservient to the state. There was no response to why all those other narratives are absent and these people don't want to opt into those narratives as well. Their then pushback is, well, yeah, we agree with you. All of these things would be good. They sort of concede that you should have climate change policies. They should sort of concede that young children should be politically active. They then say, but we have this other narrative, by the way, which is civics classes that can solve that problem anyway. And they accuse us of saying that we change what this narrative of ours is unique through and is different. No, we've said from literally the first second of our first half to the last second of our third half that there are three unique components that are not present in other narratives. Even if you teach about the importance of the state, the ability to process information and seek out information, and also the ability to believe that your action has good consequences and can lead to success is something that is not present in a civics class, because a civics class is only a discussion about the state, not why your actions have meaning. That uniqueness is the pushing edge that they need in a world where they're otherwise apathetic. And that is the turning point that they absolutely did not respond to. The only responses were, yeah, but this will be then taught poorly, so the inspiration they seek will not actually be translated. What are their mechanisms for this? Number one, teachers are bad teachers. I'd first posit that we've given you multiple sets of responses. Well, this is pretty simple to discuss. The ways in which state homogenizes power can harm you, and the ways in which these individuals want to, should question and critique that is something that we can standardize. It's something that is prevalent in all kinds of standardized education that we do give people. The second is we talked about a counterbalancing of teachers and how one teacher has the ability to counterbalance the other. The third reason we told you is there are no biases that work within these teachers in this discussion as well. It is something that they often are passionate about because they're victims of the state themselves, none of which get responded to. The only thing therefore left is the ability of these children to interpret it in a way in which is questionable to all authorities versus just an incremental political awareness. What is more believable? We've clearly given you more mechanisms for our side and why that translates to meaningful change. There's very little analysis on theirs. It's clear that we win.
All right, I would like to thank that speaker for the speech. This completes the debate for the round. Since this is a silent round, you'll not be receiving the oral adjudication of the decision. But feel free to approach me after the breaks are announced, either on Discord or on Messenger, where I go by Srijan Poudel. Thank you for the debate.